Brandon Sanderson has written a lot of books, and today we are going to rank all the ones that I have read. I didn't put together this tier maker, so some of these books I haven't read, but, as we find those, we'll put them in the to-be-decided sector. And again, books are very subjective, and I'm a personal pretty big fan of Brandon Sanderson, but he still has some misses in there for me. Books that I know other people actually truly enjoy that weren't really for me, and then vice versa, books that I really enjoyed, not everybody else seemed to love, so we'll just kind of get it into it here. And right off the bat, we are starting with Elantris, which is Brandon Sanderson's first written book, not his first published book, and we're going to put that in Could Have Been Better. Not a bad book by any means. There's some really good elements of it, but you could definitely tell that it was his first book that he wrote. And so I think it's just a good spot to put it in. Could have been better, because it could have been. There's some cringy dialogue and there's some awkward things in the book, but overall it's kind of a good story to me. So it could have been better, but for now it's pretty good. Up next, we got the first Mistborn in the first era, which for me is one of the best of the best. It's one of the first things I've read that was Brandon Sanderson. It was just honestly, even standalone, I really enjoyed the book. The series as a whole I think was really good, but it's just kind of hard to compete with it. It's got an amazing magic system and amazing characters that I just personally love. Then we got the next Mistborn, the Well of Ascension, which I know a lot of people actually like just as much as the first Mistborn. I personally don't like it as much as the first one. I still think it's a really good book, but I think it's not quite as good. You could tell that he was stumbling a little more in writing this one and trying to figure out how he's going to tie it into the third one. You can tell overall he had a plan from book 1 to 3, but the second one you could tell he wasn't entirely sure where he was going with it to get to book 3, but overall still a really good book. And now we got the third in the Mistborn first era, which I think is a better than the second one, but not quite best of the best tier, but I'm kind of leaving that tier kind of exclusive to a few that I have in my head. It could almost be. It's pretty close, but based on the other books that I'm putting in there, I don't think I can put it with those. I do really like the end of the series. I know not everybody does, but I thought it actually worked out really well. I thought it was a good conclusion to the series overall. Now we got the second era of Mistborn, which is where I falter and have some misses of my own personally. I don't think overall it's a bad series, but there are a lot of people that I have seen, booktubers specifically that I've seen, that didn't particularly like it nearly as much as the first era. So we're starting off with the first book, which you could tell he wrote, and you could tell he had fun writing this book. I mean, the characters are fun. This first book, you could kind of tell there wasn't a lot of depth to all of it, because it kind of felt like he wasn't sure if he was going to be doing a whole series on it yet, or if this was just going to be a standalone book. So for me, it's a solid good book, but it's nothing like the other Mistborn books, and it's definitely better than his first, because you could tell he's grown as a writer, but it's nowhere near amazing. All right, now we got the second Mistborn in the second era, Shadows of Self, which I actually think is definitely better than the first book. It's got some amazing character elements and development from beginning to end. It's got a dark cast to the whole book. I actually really enjoyed it. I don't think it's quite as good as the first Mistborn series. Again, it just felt like the first series he had so much time to permeate on the story and decide where he wanted things to go. So it's kind of hard to compete when you've got years and years of thinking of what you want to do with the series, as opposed to only a few years while working on so many other books at the same time. So I think it does hurt a little from that, but I think overall it is a really good book and easily the best in Mistborn Era 2. And this is where I have trouble ranking Mistborn Era 2 personally, because while The Bands of Mourning, I think, is a good kind of standalone book on its own, it kind of feels like it honestly kind of writes himself into some corners with it, in my personal opinion. So I'm going to put it at the top of Could Have Been Better. I don't think as part of the series it's particularly all that good. Like, it doesn't fit in very well, in my opinion. But as a standalone book, it's not. It's a solid, good book is where it would be if it was a standalone, but the issue is it's part of the series, and that's how I think of it, so it's not quite as good as any of the other Mistborns. So this is where it's going. Could have been better. Still, again, standalone book, pretty good, and in the series, not as good. So I'm putting in Could Have Been Better. I feel like there's a lot of issues in this book that kind of hurt the fourth book, which is where we're going next, which is the Lost Metal, the last in the book, or last in the series. And it's a miss for me. I know a lot of people actually really enjoyed the end of the series. I felt like it could have been honestly split into 2 books. But looking back on the series as a whole, it's clear to me that the Banes of Mourning is really where really the whole series kind of hurts from certain writing decisions that he made, and you can tell the characters are affected by it. And not like because the characters are affected, but like because he's affected by the choices he made early on. At least that's how it feels to me. And so ultimately the end of the series kind of hurts. And I know he only wanted to do 4 books, but it could have been 5, and I think it would have been a little better, honestly. But, I mean, it's splitting hairs. It's a miss for me. I know a lot of other people enjoy it. I'm not saying it's a bad book by any means, because pretty much most of what all of Brandon Sanderson has written has been good books, for sure. But it's a miss for me personally, so I'm putting it down there on the bottom. And that's it for the Mistborn. I heard he's writing Era 3, which I think could be really interesting, but it does kind of scare me for Mistborn, if I'm being honest, because I have no idea where it could go with that. But, I'm sure he's got a plan. I'm sure it's going to work out. And I'm sure he's going to have some good books. Even if they're not the best of his books, I'm sure there's going to be some good ones in there. All right, now Warbreaker is the next one we've got. And for me, it's an amazing book. It's up there. I know some people didn't really like it. It's a standalone, though he said he would like to write another book for it to kind of make it a series, I guess. And I know some people didn't really like it, and some people thought it was a miss. But for me, I think it's one of his better books. Honestly, I think it is. It's got great characters. It's got a really nice story and good character dynamics with other characters. And I think it ends really well and kind of fits in the Cosmere kind of as a whole really well. So I think it's just an absolutely amazing book. If you haven't read it, I definitely suggest it. Now for White Sands, I haven't actually read the series. I listened to it on audio, and it was fine. It wasn't anything amazing. I think it's just a little below Elantris. The story itself it's fine. I didn't have anything against the book itself, but I think part of the reason is because I listened to it. I didn't actually read the graphic novel and experience, the pictures and everything that was in it. So partly it wasn't as interesting to me, but as a whole, it was worth reading. But I probably can't put it above most of else what he's written. Up next, we have Stormlight Archives, which we have, The Way of Kings. Definitely one of the best that he's written. It is way up there. Personally, it is my favorite of the Brandon Sanderson books, followed closely by Words of Radiance. Mistborn is a close third to Words of Radiance, and depending on my mood, I can switch those. Now, I know some people like Words of Radiance more than Way of Kings, but I personally just love some of the characters and story arcs in The Way of Kings more than the Words of Radiance. Both, of course, fantastic books, fantastic start to a series. Can't fault anybody for having one over the other. They're both really good. And now we have Edge Dancer, which is supposed to go in between book 2 and book 3 of Stormlight Archives. It's hard for me to care about these novellas that kind of go in between some of these stories. And I can understand Brandon Sanderson's desire to include these really fun characters that he's invented in his head and had plans for in these books. I can understand that desire, but they're just parts of information that kind of he's trying to add a story into to bring this information into the Cosmere, but it's kind of unnecessary for the most part. A lot of these novellas are interesting and intriguing, but they're longer than I feel they need to be. They're fun one-off stories, and I'm glad they're short, but if they were any longer, I wouldn't probably finish them, in all honesty. They're fine. Let's leave it at they're fine. Oathbringer, for me, is an absolutely amazing book. I don't think it holds a candle to the first 2, and it's kind of a 50-50 on which one of these I think's better. I think they're both really good books. Oathbringer has a lot of interesting flashbacks and look-intos into certain characters, and I think it's intriguing for sure. I just don't think it is as good as the first 2, but it's definitely absolutely amazing. Hard to go wrong with the first 3. Definitely pick them up if you haven't. I just finished listening to Dawn Shard, and it's more of a miss to me than Lost Metal was. It's longer than it definitely needs to be. It has some fun characters in it, and I'm sure somebody out there really enjoys it, but for me, it's a miss. It feels like a long story for the amount of information you get towards the Cosmere, but, to each their own. I'm sure somebody enjoyed it. It's not a bad book, but it's just kind of a miss for me. All right, now we have Rhythm of War. And I'm not going to put it there, but some days I want to put it there. Some days I want to put it here. Some days I want to put it here. It's hard for me to decide on where this book goes because there are elements of it that are total misses for me. And then there are other elements of it that are absolute slam dunks. And so it's hard to decide where this goes. It probably deserves, if we're talking deserves to go here. It probably deserves to go there, but the way I feel about the book wants me to put it there. Maybe there. It's a solid book. It's definitely good. All 4 of the Stormlight archives that are currently out are all good. But this one just I get mixed feelings from it. Granted, it's the only one I haven't read twice, and I'm going to be doing so soon in between reading other series. But I just get such mixed feelings. I've only read it once, so I'm sure it'll change if I read it again. But, some days I want to put it in miss, and other days I want to put it the best of the best. So, for now, we're putting it right in the middle. Now, I haven't read any of his secret projects, so we're putting those in there. I haven't gotten to the Hope of Elantris yet, mostly because Elantris wasn't overly interesting compared to his other books, so I just haven't gotten around to it. The 11th Metal, it's one of those short stories that kind of felt unnecessary. Interesting, but felt unnecessary as a story and what it adds to the Cosmere, but it's interesting. The Emperor's Soul, though, as a novella is by far his best novella, and it stands alone so well. Definitely worth reading and picking up. It's just a great story. Got to put it absolutely amazing. It's better than Shadows of Self, in my opinion. Not quite as good as Warbreaker, but some days when I think back to this, I want to put it above Warbreaker, up there with Well of Ascension, but we'll leave it there for now. It probably doesn't deserve to be higher, but I definitely want to put it higher sometimes, so we'll leave it there. Shadows for Silence was a definite miss for me. It's definitely a miss. It was short, but it wasn't interesting, and it didn't feel like it really added anything to the Cosmere as a whole. So we're just going to put it down there. I'm sure somebody enjoys it. Sixth of the Dust is the same for me. These novellas are kind of misses, and not because the books aren't particularly good. It feels like he has one piece of information he's trying to add to the Cosmere that doesn't need to be a whole book, but he wants to make it a short story because there's just barely too much information to put it into something else, but almost not enough to make it a book. That's kind of how I feel about them. And so they end up being misses, but I'm sure there's plenty of people that enjoy them. They're not bad books, again. They're not bad stories by any means, but they're just kind of misses. And if they were any longer, I probably wouldn't have finished them. I haven't gotten to the Allomancer Jack story. I know what it's about, but I haven't gotten to it, along with the Hope of Elantris. I haven't gotten to either one of those. It's kind of, because of the books that they're tied to, hard for me to want to get into those when there's so many other things I want to be reading. So I just haven't gotten to them, but I'm sure I will get around to them at some point. And lastly, we have Secret History of Mistborn, which I actually think added quite a lot to the Mistborn series / world as a whole, and added a lot to the Cosmere. So I think it's actually really interesting. It made a solid book. It's not too long. It's not too short. It's got some of the better characters, in my opinion, from Mistborn. So it's definitely a solid book. It's nowhere near amazing because of just the nature of the novellas, but that's what they ended up being. So there you have it. That is my tier list of all of the Cosmere Brandon Sanderson books. I've read more of his, but these are the Cosmere-related ones. I'm sure that some of you have some big disagreements with me, so yeah, put those in the comments. Let me know what I've done wrong. Let me know what I've done right. This is how I feel about them. Some of them move back and forth from time to time, but I'm definitely excited to see what the 5th book has in store of Stormlight, to see where things go, because we can keep updating this list as we go.